Hello, my name is Natalia Willett-Grice, and we are in the mini-series for asset protection. So the first video is about asset protection in general. I really recommend you watch that one first. The second one, we talked about limiting liability and how that's different from asset protection, but it's part of the goals. The third video talked about creditor protection, again, as another goal of asset protection, but not as the same as asset protection. The fourth video talked about tax minimization as part of how you protect your assets as one of the main goals of asset protection. And in this video, we are going to talk about sheltering assets. Yeah, sheltering assets. Again, part of, but not the same as asset protection. Sheltering assets is the process of removing assets from your direct ownership and your direct control, so that if you do end up with a judgment against you, judgment creditors, those assets can't be counted as part of a way to satisfy those judgments, right? So that's what sheltering means. It means sheltering them from creditors, from the eyes and hands of creditors. Too often, people make the mistake of thinking that if they place assets into a trust, that immediately is going to shelter them from creditors or shelter those assets from creditors. But the reality is that only specific kinds of trusts can shelter assets. You know, if you put your assets into a revocable living trust, you're not going to shelter them from your personal creditors. That's not how it works. They can be designed, though, right? We can have trusts that are designed to shelter assets. If you place them into them, and your revocable trust can be designed to shelter assets for your other beneficiaries, just not you. So it can help you shelter assets from your children's creditors, from your grandchildren's creditors, including their spouses. So you can do this for loved ones, but a revocable trust cannot be done to shelter assets for yourself. All right, so putting assets into land trusts alone is also not sufficient to shelter those assets from your personal creditors. Why? Because these are seen as grantor trusts. But when they're prepared strategically in conjunction with other entities and maybe neutral trustees, they can provide a level of asset sheltering and isolate them from other assets that you own, so that creditors' claims arising from assets held in a land trust are stuck with whatever assets the land trust has, right? Irrevocable trusts can provide maximum sheltering for assets. So these are the types of trusts that are used to shelter assets that you hear about, like, oh, there's this irrevocable trust in, the Bahamas or whatever. Those are trusts that are used for the deepest level of asset protection, okay? But there are real costs involved in having irrevocable trusts. First, they're some of the most expensive trusts to set up and administer. As they've got to the nature of bankruptcy courts and the ability of creditors to grab assets when something is in bankruptcy, they've got to be set up in foreign jurisdictions for the most part. Island nations, specific island nations. You can expect to pay 5 to 6 figures easily to set up these asset sheltering irrevocable trusts that are in other jurisdictions. And you can easily expect thousands of dollars annually in administration costs. So it is expensive to shelter assets to the deepest level possible. You've got to weigh that, right? Do I want to really shelter my assets to that degree and have the expense of administering that? Or do I want to also engage in practices that just reduce my risk of getting sued and getting judgment creditors, so that I have more control and ownership of my own assets, right? So that's the number one thing, right? You've got to remember there's high costs involved. And second, for a true asset protection type of a trust, you've got to give up total control. You do, because the assets now have to be given to a trustee who has the absolute discretion over whether to release a penny to you or not. That's how it's truly become something that is protected and sheltered from creditors. You should also take into account that many times these trusts have to be in places with the assets that you wish to protect for years in advance of there being a judgment creditor, right? You can't create these last minute when you're already served with a lawsuit and effectively shelter your assets. It's not going to work. There's a look back period for creditors, and it's often 2 or more years. For certain types of governmental creditors, it's up to 5 years. So these things have to be planned significantly in advance if you want to use irrevocable trust vehicles to shelter assets to the fullest extent. So again, sheltering assets, part of asset protection, but not the same as asset protection.